And welcome. As we gather together, please take time to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you are joining us from, what organization, community, parish, diocese you are representing today. We also have some polls for you to participate in, which we hope to provide some additional insight as we discuss the theme of equity. We will launch our first poll in just a few seconds, so please feel free to answer it when you are ready. Also, as you enter in, know that these sessions are being recorded because we do hope to provide them for different folks to utilize for ongoing use. My name is Margaret Matiasevich. I serve as the Executive Director of Word and Witness, a national community dedicated to catechesis and evangelization. I serve on the steering committee for the Catholic Cares Coalition and am honored to be with you today. For those of you that aren't aware and are just learning about Catholic Cares, we have 56 Catholic organizations dedicated to 3 particular goals. One, we want to leverage our communication channels and resources to share consistent information about the importance and moral responsibility of individuals to accept a COVID-19 vaccination when available. 2, we want to provide human, spiritual, and pastoral support for those struggling to understand, affirm, and act on Catholic social teaching, including the teachings of Pope Francis and the U.S. Catholic bishops. If you haven't had a chance, I hope you've seen Pope Francis's new video for specifically the Americas that just was revealed last week. Our third goal is to advocate for the equitable distribution of the vaccine in the US and globally, which is a key part of our session today. You can always find more information, resources, and news updates about the coalition on CatholicCares.org or follow the hashtag CatholicCares. Today is the 4th of 5 formation sessions. This session, entitled Equity, aims to address the complexity of this pandemic and the shadow pandemics that have followed, highlighting the vast inequity in our world. As a Catholic community, how can we remain focused on those on the margins? What does this mean for vaccine distribution and accompaniment? And what is the expectation of me, my local community, school, ministry, to address these inequitable realities? Those are some of the key pieces we hope to look at today. We have 4 impactful church leaders leading us in this discussion. First, we have Father Charles Chalufya, who is the coordinator of the African Task Force of the Vatican COVID-19 Commission. He is a Jesuit priest in Africa, working for the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar, also known as JCAM, and as director of the Justice and Ecology Office, JEO, since 2018. The JCAM, Justice and Ecology Office, works to foster and coordinate the Jesuits' work in economic, social, migration, gender, and climate issues in Africa. JEO is a vital Jesuit interface between global policies in the economic, social, and environmental spheres and local issues confronting populations in Africa. In his current work, one of the key areas Father Charles is involved in is vaccine equity, with a special focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to his current appointment, Father Charlie served at the Copperbelt University, a public university in Zambia, where he worked in the School of Business and the University of Chaplain. In the School of Business, Father Charlie taught research methods in business and economics, as well as history of economic thought. Brian Kane will also be joining us as a Senior Director of Ethics for the Catholic Health Association of the United States. Dr. Kane serves as a resource for CHA members, including theologians, ethicists, and executives within the ministry, as well as CHA staff, and other individuals and groups with shared interests. He is responsible for developing programs and materials on clinical and organizational ethics, and assisting in promoting church relations between the ministry and individual bishops, as well as the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He is the editor of Healthcare Ethics USA and writes a regular column for Health Progress. We also have Mary Beth Powers, who is the CEO of the Catholic Medical Mission Board and has spent more than 25 years working in public health around the world, supporting teams to design, implement, and evaluate efforts to improve maternal and child health outcomes. And lastly, we have John Michael Reyes, who will serve as our prayer leader throughout this session. He has been accompanying us the whole time to put us in a posture of discernment every time we gather. John Michael is a spiritual life coordinator and director of prayer and worship for Sacred Heart Schools in California, and he assists with Team RCIA, a free online resource for the catechumenate ministry. He has experiences as a hospital chaplain, retreat director, and as a campus minister for Jesuit universities, particularly in the area of liturgy and sacramental formation. He holds a Master of Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University and is currently in the certificate program for liturgical art and architecture at St. John's School of Theology and Seminary. So welcome to our newcomers today, Father Charles, Brian, and Mary Beth. As a reminder to everybody, as we enter this experience, we ask that you keep your microphones muted, but we will have some opportunity for some Q&A throughout. So we do ask you to put in any of your questions when a speaker is presenting in the chat feature, so we can curate those questions and bring them to our speakers to address them as best that we can. Thanks in advance for your participation. And just as an update to the poll, vaccination percentages, we are now at exactly 60%. We had a complete rush of vaccination over this past week, so that is a great push of increase. Now to lead us in our next effort is John Michael, our prayer leader.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. I invite everyone to settle into where you are. And as we talk about equity today, consider the moments in your life in this past year, your year and a half, of where this concept of equity has crossed your own lived experience, in particular about the COVID vaccine. So as we begin in prayer, I invite everyone to take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. For these next few minutes, I'll invite everyone to join me in a guided meditation loosely based on the Examen made popular in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, where we review the day, looking back at consolations, things good, desolations, or the shadow side, things not so good, of where God might have been. But for our moment at this moment, we will look at it through the lens of COVID equity, COVID vaccine equity. So to begin, I invite you, wherever you are, to settle into your seats. If it helps to put your hands down if you're typing away, or if you have anything in your hands, to just enter into this moment, to give yourself permission to reflect. I invite you to acknowledge how you are feeling in this moment. If being calm is hard, acknowledge it. If you find yourself frustrated or stressed, acknowledge it. Our loving God wants to be present in all parts of our lives, not just the easy or serene moments. As we continue to reflect back on our own inner chapel of where God dwells in our hearts, let us ask for light and insight as we give ourselves permission to reflect. I invite you to take a moment to think about how COVID-19 has impacted your life. Maybe there are gifts and graces that have emerged because of what the pandemic has taught you. What have we learned about ourselves, our communities? Acknowledge and thank God for them. Was there anyone or anything that made you feel grounded during this time? or continues to? For today's session, equity will be the focus at the moment. Access to vaccines and who has not. This moment of reflection can help us realize who we may often choose not to see or connect with. Is there a person or a group of people, especially affected by COVID-19, that you don't often choose to see or connect with normally? What connections to others are you becoming more aware of? Who do you normally reach out to and connect with? Who do you avoid or refuse to see or connect with? At this next invitation, if you can, I invite you to picture the faces or put yourself in their shoes, so to say, with the following scenarios. I invite you to note your emotion when presented with this without judging or overanalyzing. Simply acknowledge, pay attention, and note where God might be showing God's self. Consider a person in a minority community who has taken part in the experimentation of vaccines but lost trust in the process. There has been emerging data received that lower income communities are less likely to be vaccinated. Imagine if you were part of that demographic. Or, what about this example? I can't get a vaccine because I'm too busy to work and I don't have enough time. Consider if you were a medical worker, a nurse, so to say, who is administering vaccines. And as you hold the vial in one hand, you notice that there's a little bit left. What should you do knowing that people in other parts of the world do not have access to a vaccine? If you are part of the powers that be controlling patent processing, how would you proceed? Or maybe you work in the medical and science community dealing with the actual creation of vaccines. How would you feel? Where would your heart be? Or imagine if you are involved with the transportation of vaccines. Vaccines have to be kept frozen. If you're driving and there was a delay, what would you do? Consider the experience we heard in January with a truck being stuck in a snowstorm and hundreds of vials of vaccine. Or if you're immunocompromised, is it time for the booster shot? Or if you were working on creating and developing the vaccine, realizing that to develop it, cell lines used in its development were derived from non-viable embryos. Where do you stand with that? And as we heard today that the Pfizer vaccine has been given FDA approval, today in my own context, questions arise about whether it should be given off label to children. If you were a parent with a young child, what would you do? Maybe you have your own experiences and anecdotes and stories. Consider those other moments of vaccine equity. Realize that we are all connected or disconnected to one another. I invite you to pick a connection or lack thereof that seems important, significant, or manifesting itself the strongest. I invite you to pause and reflect on where you're invited to grow from that moment. Invite you to take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. And as we look to this coming hour and a half, let us pray for God's grace to be open, to receive, to share, and to build up our community of faith as we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for joining me in that examen, and I will pass it off to Mary Beth.
Thank you so much, John Michael. And I want to thank Victoria for helping me run the slides just to share with you. But actually, the examen was just a great way, because that's sort of what I did thinking about this conversation today. I'm really grateful for the chance to talk with you about vaccine equity and with the other experts on the panel. And I just wanted to really give you a few more things to think about to set the stage for the comments of the other speakers, and share with you a few slides that I think will illustrate some of the points that I want to make. So, but we can just leave this slide up while I take you on a bit of a journey that I went on preparing for this. So maybe many of you are like me, and you kind of have lost a little bit of a sense of time during the pandemic. So when I thought about this presentation, I really had to retrace my steps to think, what were my reactions to the data? What was my reactions to the information that was coming out? And what was my reaction to exactly what John Michael was encouraging us to think about, how people on the margins were really faring through this pandemic. And as CEO of an organization, CMMB, that works on supporting healthcare delivery globally, particularly in lower resource settings, from the beginning, I was really thinking about how is COVID going to play out in the developing world. That's where I spent my career working on programs around the world. But it was really hard to focus on that at the very beginning. So maybe some of you remember, like I do, like after the first stories out of China, there was a lot of grim pictures of the situation in Italy and parts of Europe that were heavily affected in February and March of 2020. So that was my first kind of seeing it come to life on news screens in front of me. And then I live outside New York City, and just seeing the numbers creep up in New York in April and May, seeing ships brought off the coast to handle extra patients, to seeing trucks that were hospitals that were overwhelmed, and trucks that were iced for the casualties. That was really my experience of the epidemic in the very early days. And maybe a lot of you can also kind of remember where your thoughts were and what your initial concerns and reactions were and who you worried about in your family or in your community. CMMB started working with the Catholic Cares Coalition early this year, but with this particular concern, thinking about global vaccine equity due to our own work in global health. But working with the coalition really reminded me that we also really needed to look at equity in our own neighborhood to start. So from those early days of the pandemic, you may remember the news stories that we had seen in the United States about how various populations, particularly people in minority groups, were suffering greater infection rates and worse outcomes than people who were white. Some of this could have been due to the employment of those persons who were disproportionately working in healthcare or service industries or production industries, where work from home was not an option. I had to recognize my own privilege that that was something I could do, was work from my house, but that wasn't an option for everybody. Or maybe for other people, they lived in crowded settings where it was much easier to transmit the virus, or much harder to isolate if you found out you were infected. So I personally knew the first two people I heard of who succumbed to COVID happened to be a Hispanic father whose children went to grade school with my children in the suburbs, and a nurse that I knew who was born in Africa, and she got infected working at a hospital in Queens. So my own experience of COVID from those early days was just, I had this sinking feeling, like in so many other areas of public health, in some way your racial or ethnic background or your zip code was going to determine your infection rate, maybe the severity of your illness, and even the quality of care that you received. And then the research really bore this out. So if you go to the next slide, this is, I just collected some slides that I thought might help you guys have a picture of some of the data that really challenges our reality about whether we were trying to do things equitably. This is relatively old data because the Atlantic discontinued this project in March of 2021, but it does give you a picture of the outcomes that were worse among minority communities than for white communities. So that's not to say that there weren't illnesses or poor outcomes for whites as well. But I personally felt like I was hearing more stories of people of color who were affected. And I, maybe like some of you, finally felt like I had to stop watching the news, as I found it really difficult to watch solitary people often suffering in hospital rooms, exhausted health workers who are putting themselves at risk, like the nurse I knew who lost the battle with COVID in May of 2020. So that's how I was feeling at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know about many of you, but once I heard the news of vaccines that were in the final stages of development, that came out in sort of the late 2020, I felt a tiny bit of hope after a long, sad spring, summer, and fall. And I hope that, at least to begin with, we would really take care of health workers, that they would have early access to vaccination. Older people who are at high risk and also were suffering from the effects of prolonged isolation, they would get their vaccines early as well. And that we would find ways to protect the communities that seem to be suffering the most consequences. So it does seem that the rollout coverage in the United States did begin with health workers and other direct service providers, older Americans, and increasingly, though that got covered, we weren't maybe as successful, and we'll look at some data later about economically vulnerable populations and people of color. That didn't necessarily happen as well in the United States as we would have wanted if we were looking at this work with a health equity lens. So there are many sources of this data. I'm going to share one at the end of the presentation to just look county by county, but I'm sure a lot of you have been watching this data as well. So given the work of my organization and some of the vulnerable and fragile places around the world, I expected that health workers would quickly be vaccinated in other countries as well, as they really are our first line of defense. And then we would go on to other vulnerable populations. But looking at the data and recognizing the investment made by the US government in vaccine development, frankly, the United States was going to benefit from the fruits of this research and the ability to pay top dollar for the successful vaccine candidates. That was going to be easier for wealthier countries. At the same time that people began writing about that topic, in December of 2020, Pope Francis began speaking about the importance of, or the important challenge in front of us in terms of vaccine distribution and equity. And he recognized that there was going to be this global competition for vaccine purchasing, and it was already emerging. The first vaccines were being purchased by the US and the UK, the AstraZeneca vaccine, in May of 2020, before any significant research had even been done on the vaccines. So if you just go to the next slide, the Pope, being concerned about these issues, was speaking at the beginning of the World Bank meetings in a letter to the World Bank and the IMF meetings in April of this year. He said, we cannot allow the law of the marketplace to take precedence over the law of love and the health of all. That was a very important message. It echoed his comments about us all being in the same boat, about themes that were covered in Fratelli Tutti. But unfortunately, by that time, by April of 2021, the writing was already on the wall, as so many governments had pre-ordered vaccines. That is, they were not even assured that the vaccines would work, but they were worth ordering in case they proved effective. And because they weren't sure which vaccines would prove effective, governments with the money invested and hedged their bets by buying and advance purchasing even more vaccines from different manufacturers to make sure that they would lock in some winning options. So what did that look like? I have a couple of graphs I wanted to share. If you can bring those up, Victoria. These were put together by a group called the Duke Global Health Innovation Center. They have a website that's really worth looking at that's called launchandscalefaster.org, and it has a whole section on COVID-19. So if you're interested in this kind of data about the purchasing, about how this all happened, that inequity got baked into the equation very early, and you can see in the data that Duke has collected. So wealthier countries started placing orders, as I said, as early as May of 2020, before any of the vaccines were considered even quite viable. And by the summer of 2020, Canada, the UK, and the EU countries had already purchased more than enough vaccine for their populations, pre-ordered more than enough vaccine for their populations. So this first table shows the income groups of countries that have ordered vaccine purchases to date, showing that wealthier countries were able to put in orders for 9 billion doses of vaccines, if you add up those first two columns. And then low and middle income countries combined purchased only 3.5 billion doses. And COVAX, which is the facility that was set up by UNICEF and Gavi and other international agencies to help procure vaccines for lower income countries, they had ordered 3.2 billion vaccine doses. So it just goes to show that a lot of the market had already been kind of cornered by wealthier countries very early on. The second table, if you switch to that, Veronica, and I'm sorry, I put a little thing about the EU on there. It shows that Canada led the way with purchase orders for 10.4 vaccines per inhabitant in Canada. The EU is at 7.07. In the United States, the US government pre-ordered 5.2 vaccine doses per person in the United States. So it just shows that, again, there was this mass rush, just what the Pope had warned us about, of letting market forces kind of control the way that the vaccines would be distributed. But there were massive purchases by countries that were high income countries, and then some middle income and lower middle income countries found that they were a little bit behind the eight ball and got into the game. So you see, Brazil, Peru, et cetera, trying to get involved in advance ordering vaccines. All of these things get back to this issue of health equity and what we wanted to talk about today. What do we even mean by equity when it comes to healthcare? Fortunately, we have an ethicist on the panel who can probably better explain the topic and some of the relationship to our own Catholic social teaching, but let me share some perspective from a public health professional. Basically, equity has to do with whether some groups are systematically kind of left out or structurally denied care because of a certain characteristic. And if you go to the next slide in trying to research the topic, I found this definition quite helpful. So health equity from Paula Braverman at UC San Francisco, health equity means social justice in health. That is, no one is denied the possibility to be healthy for belonging to a group that has been historically, economically, or socially disadvantaged. I found that definition very helpful, and it really is something that is how we have been paying attention to vaccine equity as part of the Catholic Carers Coalition. Are there groups that are systematically left behind or being denied access to the vaccine because of their economic or social status? So we have to look at whether the system that was, I don't even know if we can say it was designed, but the system that happened in terms of vaccine buying and vaccine distribution around the world was designed to create equity, or whether structural barriers continue to exist, which gave some priority and others were left without protection. If we look at that just in the United States, going back to the US context, where at least initially just applying for appointments, I mean, maybe some of you remember I was trying to help older folks in my parish get appointments online because they couldn't manage the New York State website. So people trying to use technology left many people without access to the vaccine who wanted to get vaccinated, but they either were not computer literate or they didn't have access to Wi-Fi. And that really is the case for many socially disadvantaged groups. There were also uneven education about the vaccines themselves, concerns among some groups about, including valid worries about past medical testing, and some circulating misinformation that reduced getting vaccinated early. So there were people who wanted to get vaccinated, but found barriers. There were people who had doubts and they hung back and didn't elect to go get vaccinated early. And then if you look at, there are also studies of things like what's called greater vulnerability. So the CDC has a measure of socioeconomic status, housing, transportation, ethnicity, and race. And that does show lower vaccine coverage rates in more vulnerable, less affluent communities around the country. So while Margaret is right, in the last week or so, the last couple of weeks, the spread of the Delta variant and today's good news on the FDA approval of at least the Pfizer vaccine, we're hoping that more people who've been previously hesitant will go and get vaccinated. But to date, we have very uneven coverage in the United States. So maybe if you bring up the next slide, we'll show this is the COVID vaccine tracker map. I think I pulled this from the New York Times website. I know a number of people are featuring this data, but it's a county by county tracker. And you can see there are certain counties in certain states. You can, when you hover over a specific county, you can find out how that county is doing. But there are certain places in the United States which definitely had better coverage, maybe because they had more educated people or there was a greater outreach, et cetera. But there are other places in the United States, particularly where we've seen the Delta variant quite causing a lot of hospitalizations in the southern United States where there wasn't as much coverage with the vaccine. And so this very uneven map of coverage suggests a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes that have led to inequitable distribution of the vaccine in the United States. If we wanted to look at then what's happening on the international front, as I said, the buying power of more wealthy countries affected early access to the vaccine. And then there's a second problem, which is even once COVAX was able to purchase the vaccine and started to deliver the vaccine to countries, there are a lot of complicated mechanisms needed to deliver the vaccine to actual people. Getting shots in people's arms was also complicated. So there was a slow release of funds to COVAX from donors that hampered their ability to enter contracts. And then there were complicated mechanisms for those contracts. And then there's a difficult situation on the ground. COVAX needed to find both the money to buy vaccines, but also help governments be ready to distribute the vaccines on the ground. And that required refrigeration for a number of the vaccines. Most of the vaccine candidates required very cold refrigeration. It also required transportation. It required mobilization of communities on the ground to get in place to come to the vaccination center. And they had to have skilled staff ready to go. And CMMB has been part of vaccination mobilization in Haiti. We've also been part of vaccine distribution, bringing it out to communities in very rural South Sudan. That we had to have skilled staff ready to go. We had to have the cold chain maintained so the vaccine could be kept cold. And we had to do this on a very fast turnaround amount of time. So it is a complicated vaccination program to run. And most countries don't have experience running vaccination programs for adults. It's primarily the vaccination programs that most of us in public health are familiar with are really established to vaccinate small children. So if we look at the next slide, that tells you a little bit about the results of this kind of uneven coverage. So this is also from the New York Times, which has great coverage. If you don't subscribe to the New York Times COVID page, you really might want to. It shows how many daily doses per 100,000 people have been given out since the vaccines became available. So you can just see in this diagram how far behind Africa really lags. And you have to ask yourself whether there's any ability to catch up. What would the goal was to have Africa vaccinated at about 20% by the end of the year. And that to me looks like a very difficult goal to achieve by the end of the year, given the current status. So, we are part of one big human family. We have, 211 million cases confirmed globally. That's likely an underestimate because many people were undiagnosed around the world. There have been 4.4 million deaths globally. That's also possibly an underestimate. And 4.9 billion doses of the vaccine administered. And you can see from the slide just how inequitably that distribution has taken place around the world. So it feels to me like we're in a very difficult spot to even talk about getting closer to vaccine equity because there's so much work that has to be done to redistribute vaccines to both the resources that are needed to get the vaccines, but also the resources that are needed to deliver them on the ground. And that is really going to be the big challenge for vaccine equity as a global concern. Just one final concern that I have is just this weekend, the United States government began to okay booster shots for eligible Americans. So first, there was a discussion just about those with weakened immune systems. Now they're really talking about the need for getting most Americans a booster dose later this year, sort of 6 to 8 months after you completed your vaccine. And I just, wanted to quote one WHO official who really likened it to giving people with a life jacket an additional life preserver rather than passing them out to people who still don't have a life jacket. So that's, to me, some of the really important global health equity concerns that I'm really feeling as I look at these issues and as I participate as part of the Catholic Cares Coalition working on vaccine equity. So I hope I've given you a few things to think about and some data that is worth considering as we consider health equity. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Beth. I put a poll up actually to have people think about, have they considered the ethical issues around receiving the vaccine while others have no access, just so we can kind of get an assessment of where people are. I think you've done a great job in helping us begin to form a deeper sense of awareness and conscience formation. So thank you for that. But I also wanted to pull out something from the chat that you actually, it was put in the chat prior to one of your last slides, that really wanted to have us keep in mind that procurement is one thing, effective distribution without any delays is another thing. And yet there is this third challenge of effective, equitable in-country vaccination. And one of your opening comments was how early on you wanted to turn off the news. And I think that really resonated with most people in this room together. What advice do you have for folks when it's just become so overwhelming and we feel somewhat defeated especially at this stage of the pandemic, around these issues of equity. What is your advice of one thing that someone ordinary like myself could do to really make a difference?
I mean, I think, we've been involved in advocacy, really trying to talk to the Biden administration and other people in power about the importance of sort of sharing the surplus, about sharing the resources to create vaccines elsewhere, not just in the United States and not just in Europe, but the importance of sharing the technology so that vaccines could be developed, delivered, produced in more places so that we could get the numbers bigger. But the comment in the chat is right from my colleague Ariel, like even if we had the numbers, we have to also have the systems on the ground ready to distribute safely. So using your voice to talk, if you feel like you can talk to policymakers, talk to policymakers. If you feel like you can't talk to policymakers, you really can talk to your neighbor. I mean, I have a son who has a number of friends who are in their 20s in the United States who have not been vaccinated yet. And I've just been really trying to lean on him. Like, this is important. This is something you can do. They could be interacting with children who are too young to be vaccinated. They could be interacting with older people who have immune compromised positions. Like they have a responsibility to take care of their neighbors. And I really, I immediately ordered my CHA USA mask that said, "Love thy neighbor." It's really something I wear all the time. I just spent a week in the Midwest wearing that because people aren't asking, they are not thinking about the implications of my actions have on my neighbors. And so I just think even if you can convince one person, I would consider that a real victory. A person is resistant, trying to give them the information that might help them really consider the impact on themselves and people around them. Oh, you're on mute, Margaret.
Oops. I said, thank you very much. The more that we care for one another at this stage of the pandemic and encourage people to overcome some vaccine hesitancy, the more likely our distribution doesn't need to be so heavy-handed. Hopefully we can consider a greater equitable distribution and put our efforts towards that. And I appreciate you giving us a voice, whether that be to one person, a community, or even our representatives. So thank you so much, Mary Beth, for your presentation. It looks like we have 83% of our folks have considered, another when thinking about the vaccine in this point in the game. So, well, in the process, I should say, not game. So thank you so much. And to lead us into Brian Kane, I have one more poll that I'd like to pull up. It'll help us transition from Mary Beth into Brian Kane. It says, do you think that since the United States government invested in vaccine development, the US had the right to procure enough vaccine for its whole population? As you're going ahead and participating in that, I'm going to leave Brian to help us kind of navigate the depth of that question and its moral implications. Thank you so much, Brian, for being with us today.
For having me. Just give me a second to share my screen and we'll be off and running. Sorry. One second. Try this again. Sorry, the poll keeps stopping me from getting this going. Okay, let me try this one last time. There we go. So what I want to do in terms of my participation is just to give a sort of high level explanation or probably a reminder to a lot of people of Catholic social teaching, especially as it relates to issues of justice and equity. And so the goal would be that first thing, the learning outcomes, the three things I'd like to get through is really just talk about what are called first order principles of Catholic social teaching, and then to look specifically at how you put those into practice operationally, and then to apply it to a couple different ethical issues as it relates to vaccines. So the first thing I'm going to say is that when we look at these first order, these kind of solid foundations for Catholic social teaching, we're really looking at the interrelationship between three particular ideas. So the first one's going to be human dignity. The second is really a further understanding of what the common good is, and then how justice is play in both of those things. So in terms of human dignity, we as a church believe in the sacredness of human life, so that every single individual is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore they have an innate dignity simply by virtue of our creation. And so that when we talk about the ethical concept of, we are ends and not means, we are not to be used by other people for their own goods. We exist for ourselves, we exist to be with each other, we exist to be in community with God. And so human dignity then is the most basic human quality that defines how we think about equity. Human dignity is also relational, so that we can't talk about rights only without also responsibilities. So that where we are individuals who have a dignity, we also have a social nature, so that we're not just individuals seeking our own purposes, but really that we have to think about others. That's part of the way in which we're created. So it's neither rights alone nor responsibilities alone. It's a community of persons who seek the same goods. And so the second concept here is really this idea of the common good. In Vatican Council II, the definition given by Gaudium et Spes is that the common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment. So in other words, it's not the greatest good for the greatest number. It's not about seeking it for yourself, but really that we have a common treasury, a common purpose in order to form that kind of community that enables everybody to be enriched and to grow to their fullest potential. And so this idea of individual human dignity and our communal dignity, in a sense, that's the common good, work together and are interrelated. Justice is really the way in which these connect. So we talk about different descriptors of what justice is. We can talk about contributive justice, which is the relationship of an individual to the community at large. We can talk about distributive justice, which is how to give the goods of society to everybody equally. And then we can also talk about how the parts interrelate to one another, so the contractual sense of justice. The key part about justice is that it's based upon this idea of interdependent relationships, so that we seek justice together. We don't seek justice just as individuals. So these three things work together. Human dignity leads to the common good, which leads to justice, and they're mutually self-affirming. So equity, we talk about equity, it's really this question of applying justice to our relationships. So as many know, it's not the same as equality. It's not about everybody being given the same thing. It's really about providing those conditions that people need to flourish. And so some people may need more than others. Equity is about providing what people need in order to be the persons who God created them to be. Second piece I want to talk about are operational principles. How do we put into practice innate human dignity, the common good, and justice? And there are a lot of different principles under these. We're just going to focus upon a couple of these as they relate more specifically to our discussion about vaccines. So the first thing we can say is that there has to be meaningful work. And part of the issue, I think, when we look at equity issues, and this is something that was mentioned in the first presentation, is that not everybody had the same ability to protect themselves from the vaccines. So that work, when we look at work, we have to try to make it as meaningful as possible for people, but we also have to look at the social conditions under which people work. So people should be fulfilled by their work, but there's also an aspect in which that work is a social justice and a communal aspect of the work that we do as well. And so with that, there's a rights to workers. Basic rights have to be respected. We need to take care of each other. We need to try to provide the conditions where people can safely work and provide services. So as I'm sure as many of you recall, we had all of these confrontations across the country where people didn't want to wear masks in stores. And, in one sense, it's just a basic form of justice to be, looking out for the rights of the people who are working there, who don't have a choice, whose work is in this public facing role. So, again, we set the conversation up, I think, in the United States a lot as emphasizing more of individual freedom rather than the sense of communal responsibility. And so the virtue of solidarity is, again, that we have to have a habitual view of how our relationships work, that we want to be connected to one another, that we want to seek out what's good for somebody else. And solidarity really is that taking that view from somebody else's perspective. And as part of that sense of solidarity, we in the Catholic tradition talk about this preference for the poor and vulnerable. Now, we should be doing things that will help them to get on their feet, that enable them to survive this. And as we looked at the statistics in the first presentation, it has hit poor communities of color a lot worse than it has other kinds of communities in the United States. And that's also true globally. Poor countries, poor communities are bearing the burden of a lot of the pandemic. So subsidiarity is the principle that we ought to put the power of making decisions at the lowest possible place in society. And so while we do have to have national and even international efforts to address big issues like pandemics, at the same time, we want to drive those decisions as to how to act ethically to the local level wherever possible so that people on the ground are involved in the power of those decisions. So we sometimes need to have larger structures and they help, but as much as possible, we should try to push the power down to the local level. Stewardship is, again, we don't radically own anything. So the question raised before about privileging wealthy nations in terms of vaccines, this has always been a perennial issue for pandemics. And we've seen it every single time that when something like this comes up, the wealthy nations do get in there first. They do control the goods for their populations, and only later does it sort of trickle into poorer nations. So we have to, as a community, constantly remind the world, this is something that we ought to be considering again, the poor, the vulnerable, those who are most affected, to be able to get access to these resources. So the three things I'd like to talk about in terms of application is some of these issues that come up in terms of discussions about the vaccine. So I want to talk briefly about the whole issue of aborted fetuses and mandatory vaccinations, talk about the emergency use authorization for vaccines and how that also applies to issues of equity, and then again, come back to this issue of the just distribution of vaccines. So the first thing I'll say is that there's been a lot of ethical controversy with regard to the development of the vaccines that we have, because they have been in their developments, they have used immortalized cells or cell lines that came from an aborted fetus in the Netherlands in the 1970s. And so some people have had moral quandary with regard to the use of these vaccines. I would say, from my position as a Catholic ethicist and theologian, I agree with what the Vatican says, which is that the relationship of these vaccines to that abortion, decades ago, is tenuous at best at this point, and should lead us towards really talking about moral responsibilities to get a vaccine that really does help the society as a whole. So while there's a place for talking about not using such cell lines, I think the moral responsibility here is greater for the common good, and that we ought to be seeking out those vaccines. Second issue that came up is really the question of the emergency authorization of these vaccines early on by the FDA. So until today, when Pfizer was approved for complete use, these have all been considered experimental vaccines. I think that there certainly is a place for saying, we want to be hesitant sometimes before we accept experimental medicines. But again, given the present circumstances, I think, and really with the track record, as we've given millions of these vaccines, I think that this objection to the use of vaccines is waning at this point. And then the last issue is again, coming back to this, we need to create nationally and internationally better systems of distribution of healthcare resources. We have a very disparate system internationally, from capitalistic markets to those of national healthcare systems. And the difficulty is really, I think, globally, healthcare is still driven by profits. And so when we're talking about those kinds of systems, the capitalistic systems of taking priority in instances like this, we're going to get problems with the just distribution of vaccines. We're seeing, hopefully on the international level, that we're starting to push more vaccines towards those poor countries and people, but it is slow. And again, pointing to the first presentation, just looking at Africa, which we're going to be talking about in a second as well, the vaccine rates are still very, very low. But we need to come back and continue to try to create these systems of distribution and really at least bring it up, because I think a lot of people, at least in the wealthier countries, don't really think of these issues as much as they should. So with that, I will end, and I'm open to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Hi, Brian, it's Margaret. I'm hoping I can ask you a question. One, I think, this concept of pitting against the communal good, against individualism is something that's kind of a consistent conflictual narrative that we're seeing play out in our news, in our church, in our communities, and in our families. And even in the chat, there was, a comment about how language and how we use language can even separate us from one another rather than bring us together. And I'm kind of challenged because it seems so fundamentally good. By this, I mean, like deep down, we know innately what is right and wrong. We don't want to hurt one another, yet we're constantly finding us in circumstances, whether that be with words, with, positions or arguments. Do you have any advice on how we can bring Catholic social teaching in a very practical way to this ongoing reality that we keep living, within? Do you have any advice on that, Brian?
This may sound a little far out, so just go with me for a second. But I think part of the difficulty is really, especially in the United States, we're really having a conversation that are from two different philosophical points of view. I mean, so if you look at what we were saying in terms of Catholic social teaching about balancing out the common good and individualism, we see those as mutually reinforcing pieces. Yet if we look at where the United States arises in terms of its politics, that's really not the same fundamental set of expectations. And so we kind of have these terms that we throw around, which mean different things if you don't come to the same meaning. So if we talk about freedom, for example, freedom not to get a vaccine, for example, I think a lot of times people are looking at that as a don't interfere with what I choose to do, as opposed to, I think, a Catholic concept of freedom, which is to act in a way which makes you the best person that you are. Very different concepts of, don't do something versus do something. And in a sense, I think that the conversation really ought to be towards that, how can we respond to each other in the best way? And I don't think that conversation is front and center usually.
Very true. So it's very practical to just kind of come to a sense of coming to a deeper understanding of one another and a deeper sense of how each other is using certain language versus kind of assuming something of another. I think that that's a great way to start. It's almost like rewind a bit where you're at in your perspective of someone else and their position and their choice of words and language. And even, area of focus. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
No, I think it was, I don't recall the exact article. It was probably in America over the past month or so, but one of the writers in talking about vaccine mandates said, it's interesting to read some of these articles. And if you never see the term common good when somebody's talking about vaccines, there's something that's not quite right about that conversation. So it can't just be focused upon this idea of freedom from. We really need to look at, what should our response be? What should we be doing for each other?
Yeah, even a couple of weeks back, we were looking at emerging data, and one of the thoughts that kind of stuck with me is that as data keeps changing, it's a different opportunity for us to come into a deeper understanding of one another and what we can do better to care for that common good. Because we only get so far in a particular moment to live deeply into what you're saying. But as things shift, as the environment shifts, needs change, just like they do in our families and any other environment, right? So we have to constantly learn how to have that deeper understanding of caring for one another and living that out. Well, thank you so much, Brian. I have the honor now of passing the baton to Father Charlie, joining us from Africa. Welcome, Father Charlie. We're so grateful to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Could you allow me to share the screen?
We'll get right
yeah.
on that.
Yeah. So good afternoon to you. It's evening here. I'm very happy to be part of this very interesting conversation, and you know, a conversation that the world needs at the moment. Yeah, both in countries, but also at the global level. So I'll speak to a number of things that have been touched on, you know, just relate to the figures that have been presented, as well as to some of the important principles in Catholic social teaching that have been highlighted. I'd like to begin here to mention again that while countries like the US and Europe have returned to normal almost, no more masks, thanks to widespread COVID-19 vaccination, only 0.3 to 4% of people in low-income countries, and in some cases, that's a range. In some cases, it's lower than that, have had their first shot. And Mary spoke about this target of 20% by the end of the year, and WHO suggested 10% by September. Only 7 out of 54 African countries are on track to immunize 10%. As a result, what's happening here is that we now have the Delta variant causing havoc here, wreaking havoc. New waves of preventable death and sickness throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I want to emphasize that preventable death, and other speakers have referred to some of the important principles of Catholic social teaching around life, the dignity, to have reverence for life and the importance of human dignity. Yeah, and I would like to apply this concept that has been used, you know, community solidarity and the common good, to concretize it, you know, so that we ask ourselves, you know, the last question that you asked, Margaret, and you know, I'd like to just, you know, apply that now to the economics, both in countries and at the global level. How do we organize our economy, our politics, law, everything we do, okay? So that however we organize society takes into account the common good, community, that we live together. We believe that people have rights, as we have heard, but also to duties, but also to participate in society so that we seek together the common good. And now we can also speak of the global community. That's why we speak about global justice, a global society. And that is why we are together here with people in the US and us in Africa. You've heard the common saying now, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that helps us to think about the common good, because no matter how much rich countries do to vaccinate their people, but if they leave other groups in the global setup behind, still the global north won't be safe. Yeah, Brian touched on, you know, the option for the poor. Okay, and in Catholic social teaching, the basic moral test is how our most vulnerable members of society are faring. If we have a society marked by divisions between rich and poor, like we have, the vaccinated rich and the unvaccinated poor, that's a crisis. And put in secular language, we speak in the SDGs, the development goals, we speak about leaving no one behind, because even nations of the world care, that we shouldn't leave anybody behind. And the problem we are facing at the moment when we speak about some of the things that Mary touched on, the global injustice, the fact that there's a divide in terms of vaccination. This comes from far, and I would like to point to the supernatural institutional architecture that governs the world. That's where it all starts. That's why I said from the word go, we should have asked ourselves, how can we organize society, the global community, in such a way that there's equity at the global level? The problem goes to one of the roots is the way the global rules are made. In 1989, when the northern countries, the United States of America and Europe had a chance, after the fall of the Curtain Wall, to formulate rules that should ensure equity at the global level, they created the World Trade Organization, they created the IMF, the IMF was there before. But after 1990, I would like to suggest that America, Europe had a chance to create a more equitable world. But we're still far from that. And there I'm showing that figure where we have corporations, we also have governments, of the more powerful countries. And now they set rules in the WTO, like now the TRIPS, that in the end have a negative impact on vulnerable citizens in the less developed countries. The rules in the WTO end up giving us the outcomes that we have, where we have people who are not vaccinated or children suffering from malnutrition. I'm not saying they bear the entire responsibility, but there's a large part of it that comes from the global international architecture, the way rules are made at the global level and how they affect poor countries. I've given an example of TRIPS. And so the crisis that we are facing now is the global justice crisis, and really what we may term a failure of humanity. And we know that, as other speakers have mentioned, that the world, if things were set up in a better way, the world could have been producing vaccines far faster. If rich countries, like now, at least the US, has supported the TRIPS waiver, but there are rich countries like Germany, which has pushed the EU as well. They have put pharmaceutical industry interests first at the expense of human life that we have spoken about here. And they have blocked the WTO trade-related aspects of intellectual property waiver. It's something that can be changed. It's something that can be changed without those business people losing anything. Governments in the US, in Europe, have funded decades of research behind medical miracles or the vaccines that we're seeing today. So there is really no reason why business people should be afraid of TRIPS waiver. There is enough money and to produce vaccines, to protect everyone, to ensure that no country must lock down. If only Germany and some rich countries stop prioritizing the profits of pharmaceutical companies, the profits of a few rich northern people, a few Americans or a few Europeans. So like I've mentioned, we are facing what we are calling vaccine inequity is in fact global justice crisis, a failure of humanity. Inequality continues to spiral. Inequality is becoming more grotesque every day, as the WHO had mentioned recently, about a couple of months ago. Now, what does this mean? When we're talking about this problem of inequity, the problem of global injustice, and its effect in terms of inequity in vaccination, the COVID-19 here is not just a health crisis here in Africa. It has collateral damage, as people lose jobs, forced leave, pay cuts, salary suspension, and they are likely to continue because we still have the pandemic up to now. And this is exacerbated by the fact that even before the pandemic, households were at very low resilience, no savings. So if there's a lockdown here, like I will show, it just means that there's no incomes for people. So what we are facing as a health crisis in the north, here it's also a social economic crisis, okay, leading to depressed economic activity, and Africa is hard hit because it relies on tourism and commodities. Yeah. And so African countries at the moment have serious liquidity problems, increasing debt, broke governments, and with increasing human costs. Because if as governments, they don't have liquidity, they don't have the income, they have no capacity to shore up the economies as well as to ensure that health systems are working. The other problem is the spike in food prices, okay? The Food and Agriculture Organization measures every month the spikes in the price index, and it has been on the increase since May last year, globally, much worse here. So there's an increase in food, and it just means that access to food security is hampered simply because of the COVID-19 vaccine. I was talking about poverty. From 1990 to 2015, it was measured that poverty had come down. But poverty had come down in Latin America, in China and in Asia, not in Africa. In Africa, poverty had risen from 200 million to around 400 million. Last year, because of COVID-19, the World Bank estimates that there is more 40 million people, 39 million people who are poorer because of COVID. Here in Africa, so poverty is deepening. Problems with work as well as social exclusion. Like, put simply, all I'm saying is that there is no food at the table, none for 500 million poor people in Africa, or a little more than that. And I just want to also put some concrete illustration of what is going on here. I share with you these two very harrowing stories, and I share with you pictures that I myself took of suffering people, yeah, of a young lady that you see there in the picture with a spread on top, a red and black kind of bedspread, of a young lady with two children who was kicked out of her house. I'm just giving an example of some of the outcomes, because her job is to sell in the informal market. But when there are restrictions because of COVID, it means she can't sell, and because of no savings, no income, therefore no housing and no food. And there you see human dignity, at lack of human dignity being expressed there, with a young lady who has no housing, no food, and no nothing to survive by. Yeah. Another example I give you of that young lady who lives outside our city, Nairobi, and comes in and out, but because of the lockdown, she can't come in. So what she does is she avoids the police by walking 40 kilometers into Nairobi and 40 kilometers back, just to get in and sell flowers, okay, or resell flowers and earn an income. And that's becoming very difficult and more and more difficult, as because even though lockdowns have been eased, but there are still some restrictions that make it difficult for these people to do what they do. So here then, what we are trying to do in this conversation is to see how we can push this conversation and see how unreasonable it is that the safety of everyone is pushed away just to consider the profits of already super rich people. When more than 1.5 billion people now are demanding for a people's vaccine, and a few people are saying no, simply to protect their prophets. It's unfair. Yeah, talk about equity, talk about fairness. It's unfair, it's unjust. I think one way of advancing Catholic social thought, especially in times of Pope Francis, is to see how we human beings can reawaken care and compassion within us. Yeah. So that, we have the principles of Catholic social teaching, the principles from the Bible, but we can also go to how we human beings are. We have this capacity to care and to have compassion. As the Dalai Lama once said, love and compassion are not necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. And I think it was Brian who spoke to Fratelli Tutti, which is full of that, which calls rich nations and rich human beings to show compassion to the suffering so that we can build a more just world. A world where there's global justice and where no one can be left behind. And as I speak at this, to show the crisis, I show you that quotation from Boris Johnson, who praised the greed as the cause of the success of the vaccine success. That the reason we have the vaccine success is because of capitalism, because of greed, because of greed. That is not true. There are components of us being human that have this dimension, of altruism that we could leverage, that we could promote if we are to beat this problem of global inequity, of global inequity, global injustice. We need to find ways of restraining greed, not to celebrate it, if we are going to truly tackle this global pandemic. I would like to leave you with the concept of humanity from Africa, which is about the fact that one's well-being is intrinsically linked to the well-being of others. That social stability is based on the equitable sharing of resources. Ultimately, such an understanding calls for global solidarity. We call it Ubuntu here. And the world needs that logic of coexistence, working toward peaceful existence on the basis of justice, fairness, and equity. We have capacity for that. And I think that's the kind of framework that Pope Francis is giving us for concretizing and living out Catholic social teaching. As from Africa, we call humanity to Ubuntu, which emphasizes unity of humanity and promotes a culture of empathy, cooperation, resource sharing. We need a global community undergirded by these values. And from the perspective of this interconnectedness, the well-being of poor nations and their people in the interest of rich north and the rich few. So that we emphasize this aspect could lead to compromises instead of the primacy of national interests and profits of a few. I thought I should highlight those principles as Pope Francis really emphasizes them, and so that we could find a way of promoting care and compassion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Father Charlie. I have this 9 statement, interest before human life. That has really just hit me to my core as I echoed Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti, to consider a new way of relating to one another as a human family. But often this type of conversion, it begins with one person and it has to be ongoing over and over. And then that ripples out to another person and inspiring them and another. You've really left me of how can I further my own conversion to put the whole of human life ahead of my own self-interest, which, to be honest, Father Charlie, in the middle of this pandemic is a hard question. But Ubuntu will be my prayerful posture. So thank you so much. I now know Mary Beth and Brian might have some additional questions for you, Father Charlie, but such an inspiring presentation. Mary Beth, did you have a question?
Yeah, Father Charlie, if I can trouble you, first of all, thank you. That was great. It so set our heights even higher at what is the challenge in front of us. But my question, just because I'm personally sort of struggling with this decision of the US government about the booster shots for people who are relatively healthy, et cetera, who we know might in fact get an infection, but it might be, it might run its course. So it seems, at least that's what they're being quite hopeful about. Given that we have so much of the world unvaccinated, how should we be thinking about as a coalition, even describing this pressure for booster shots in the United States when so many people haven't even gotten a first shot in Africa, just as an example?
I think the principles that we have spoken to apply here, and this is what we're doing in the Vatican COVID-19 Commission, is to put a little bit of pressure as much as we can, but also using the Vatican's sort of leeway to engage nations to dissuade countries like the US from doing that. Because as has been shown in your first presentation, rich countries have already outcompeted poorer countries in getting the vaccines. And in the current scheme of things, as long as the TRIPS waiver remains, no matter what companies do, they will not be able to accord everybody an opportunity to have a shot. So to because even without the booster shot, there's such a huge shortage. So to even think of a booster shot is really, really something that is being discouraged. And we're doing some advocacy work to stop that. So some of the things we could do is to bring out the facts. Catholic social teaching also begins with C, yeah? Because some of the things that are happening here, you guys can't see them, you don't see them. So maybe what we could do, yourselves and ourselves and all of us together in the church, is to help these people see the reality of people who are suffering. That we tell them more and more stories of those who are suffering, so that they may see and see if they can have compassion and on those who are suffering. Maybe what we could do more and more is to highlight those statistics, stories like the ones I was telling, and bring them more and more to the US, to the North. Maybe that could help people like Biden and his government and others to provide leadership and do like Pope Francis is doing. And in fact, President Biden is Catholic. I mean, his values are really linked to Catholic social teaching. Maybe we could do more to share the stories, the statistics, so to move him, to provide leadership and see how we can move the world to more equity.
Brian, did you have a question? I thought I saw you unmute. Oh, I think you're muted again. I'm sorry. Something happened there.
Just a comment from Father Charlie in a sense. Apart from having the vaccines in hand, what are some of the further challenges going on in Africa right now in terms of alleviating or increasing those vaccine numbers? It's not just the vaccines, correct?
Yes. You mean from the health perspective?
Yes.
Yeah. It's the vaccines, the protective equipment, all of those are missing. And this vaccine came, it found most health care systems in Africa were not as strong as they should be. So the pandemic really was just the last, how do you put it in English? The last straw that broke the horse's back. And it revealed problems that were in existence before, or even exacerbated them. We already had serious burdens of disease here. So you had struggling governments in terms of maintaining a healthcare system. So this has just worsened the situation here, and including shortage of healthcare workers and things like that. So all of those have been worsened. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. Father Charlie, Mary Beth, and Brian, thank you for leading us in a meaningful conversation. And as I'm sure attendees can tell, the conversation is still so ripe, and there's just so much for us to address. So I hope that you continue to stay in touch with us at Catholic Cares. And I did want to let you know that as a coalition, we did send an advocacy letter to the Senate and the House of Representatives. We
Lovely.
just, yes, we just affirmed a couple of key pieces. One, that the US has provided over 100 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines around the world. And even though we think that is a life-saving effort and we're grateful for that, we know that we could do more to continue our efforts to distribute the vaccine equitably and efficiently across the globe. So we urged our representatives to provide additional funding and support for the manufacturing and delivery of COVID-19 vaccines. We felt that if the US could put in those efforts, we could help ensure that the supply of COVID-19 vaccines is sufficient to meet the ongoing global need that we started to talk about today, and help increase the capacity of low-income and developing countries to safely transport and store the vaccine, as we learned about in the different presentations, how critical that is. We also urged continued support for outreach provided by faith-based organizations and leaders that, they're most likely on the ground, boots on the ground, trying to help get the vaccine distributed, and often on the front lines in these efforts. And each of you are on the front line of these efforts, and those one-on-one conversations that Mary Beth encouraged us to, and Brian also empowered us to consider, coming to understand one another more deeply so that we can help people promote vaccine acceptance and equity. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And lastly, I did want to acknowledge that the letter also did stress the importance of strengthening the healthcare systems globally, as well as that vaccine production capacity. We urge the US to continue investing and sharing resources with other countries that are in need. So we felt that that was the most effective way for us to respond at this time in the pandemic as a coalition. As we know, the Delta variant is rampant and there is such an inequitable distribution around the world. So we hope that we can help strengthen healthcare systems and provide future health support for health emergencies like this pandemic. You will be able to find the letter on our website at catholiccares.org in the near future, which you are encouraged to utilize for your own outreach to your own representatives. And I just want to say I'm so grateful for the coalition for its tremendous work in advocating and making sure that we're always uplifting equitable distribution of the vaccine. And just last but not least on announcements, we do have one more session next week where you'll learn about the theme of a pastoral response to the pandemic. You'll find a comprehensive model utilizing the power structure to impact communities. And you'll also find an accompaniment model with a strong emphasis on mental health and trauma and care. 2 panels of speakers will provide you great practical resources for you to apply to your community to put into action some of what we talked about today, as well as in previous weeks. So I look forward to seeing you then. I now pass it to John Michael for our closing prayer.
Thank you, Margaret. And so to close, I know that we are at our time, but please stay for prayer. So I invite you, wherever you are, to take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. We have heard from 3 wise speakers that have shared their wisdom with us in our own continuing formation of our consciences with vaccine equity. And so let us pray. Creator God, who breathes life into every one of our sisters and brothers in this fragile global community, and who loves all equally, guide us to reflect on and see the stories and images of inequity that are everywhere during this difficult time. Let us be present before the images that surround our world in this pandemic. Let us respond by becoming a part of the healing that is your urgent work in our lands, where poverty and lack of resources condemn so many to suffering and death, and old structural injustices creating new pain, new loss. Let us respond to their suffering by becoming part of their healing, which is your urgent work of global justice and peace, of Ubuntu. Creator God, breathe into us your fierce love so we may be filled with the inspiration of your Spirit, and know that we must find ways to respond to these images, to pray and to work together so that everyone feels held by your love, so our world may know healing. We ask this in your many and holy names, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.
Thank you.